All right, thank you everybody for being here. I hope everybody can hear me okay. My name is Dan McClellan. I am going to be talking tonight about homosexuality and the Bible. Thank you for everybody who's joining live, and I hope you will get something out of this class tonight. I hope you will enjoy the opportunity to finally be able to interact in the chat as well. Let's keep things respectful and clean in the chat so that nobody has to be kicked out of here. A bit of a content warning. Obviously, I'm going to be talking quite frankly about some sexual topics. I'm going to address, not talk in any detail, but address things like sexual assault, pedophilia, things like that. I'm trying to think, not much else beyond that, apart from just a general somewhat sexually explicit content. So please be aware of that. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Now, I'm going to start off tonight with, well, something else I should add. I'm going to be complicating both sides of this discussion. I am going to be talking about data that is going to not fit well with a lot of the more common kind of mainstream rhetoric surrounding the question of homosexuality and the Bible. And the intent is not to pick sides, but to complicate both sides and share data so that people can arrive at more informed conclusions. And hopefully we can come to a better understanding on all sides of these issues. But I'm going to start with an optical illusion that I use quite frequently to illustrate something called dual process cognition. And this is the idea that our cognition operates on a spectrum. And on one end of this spectrum, our cognition is unconscious, it's subconscious. It is based on kind of our evolutionarily installed default features, as well as those aspects of our cognitive architecture that are conditioned through many of the common experiences of humanity. And on the other end, we have what I will refer to as reflective cognition. And this is the cognition that is slower, is more intentional, is governed by reason, logic, facts, and things like that. And these two ends of the spectrum of cognition can and frequently do come into conflict with each other. And there are two things that we can do when they come into conflict. One thing we can do is called rationalizing, and that's where we employ our reflective cognition to support, explain, defend the intuitive cognition, some kind of input from the intuitive side. The other thing we can do is called decoupling, and that is where we use the reflective side to overrule, suppress, marginalize the intuitive cognition. And those things can all happen on a spectrum between those two responses as well. So what you should be seeing here on the screen is what look like two different or two objects of different shades of gray. The one on top should appear a darker shade of gray. The one on the bottom should appear a lighter shade of gray. But what I want you to do is hold up your finger in front of the image and cover up the highlighted portion and the portion in the shadows. And if you do that, what you should notice is that both objects are actually the exact same shade of gray. There's no difference between the two. And what this is an illustration of is a feature of our cognition where your mind is interpreting this as a three-dimensional object in space. And it has spent a lifetime usually experiencing light sources coming from above, and the shadows and the ground and the color of the sky all kind of contribute to fooling your mind into interpreting this that way. And as a result, it expects the object that is on top, that should be in the light, to be lighter colored than the object that is on the bottom and is so clearly in the shadows. But because they're both the exact same color gray or shade of gray, your mind is a little confused. And so what your mind is doing is projecting onto your experience of the world around you what it wants to be seeing. And what this illustrates is the fact that our experience of the world, all of our five senses, as well as our cognition, is all mediated by our minds and what our minds expect. And so there are times when that intuitive cognition is going to overrule something, or that intuitive cognition is going to say, you're going to experience this way, even though it's may not be the input that we're receiving. And for some folks, it may not be good enough to just cover up the dark shadow and the highlight in the middle of the image. You may have to cover up the edges as well, because your minds may be more sensitive to the suggestion that this is a three-dimensional object in space. And the reason I point this out is to point out that our experience of the world is frequently governed by our intuitive cognition, and we frequently don't even know. And even when we know, we frequently can't change it. So just knowing this doesn't help me to just turn that off in my mind. That's just something that I cannot revise about my mind. And so this extends to our cognition as well. And I bring this up, excuse me, because our intuitive cognition also governs our identity politics, and it governs how we read, and it governs how we interpret texts. And all of these things are important to how people read the Bible today, individually as well as in groups, because most Bible reading is influenced by social readings of the Bible. And so one of the things that influences how we're going to interpret things is our own sense of social standing. So this is where identity politics comes into play. Humans are evolutionarily predisposed to care about their social standing, because way back in our early evolutionary history, belonging to a group and not getting thrown out of that group was critical to our survival. And so we developed a very, very deeply rooted subconscious bias towards curating and improving our standing within groups. And that influences how we think about what's important to us. It influences how we interpret things. Now, I want to go to text a little bit. If you're familiar with my social media content, you probably heard me say at one point or another that texts have no inherent meaning. And this is because there's no meaning residing in the sound waves that enter your ears, or in the pixels on a screen, or on the ink on pages. Those are just squiggles and lines and sounds. Now, we associate them with meaning by conventionalizing or coming to widespread agreements about what semantic content we are going to associate with certain combinations of sounds. And then, so that helps with spoken language. And then we also have separate agreements regarding what squiggles on a page are going to be associated with what sounds. And so when we read, our minds are actually going through their knowledge of those agreements and our experiences with those agreements, and then making a determination about what the most likely intended relationships are between what they're reading and semantic content. And it's not always a one-to-one correspondence. In fact, it's very rarely an isometric one-to-one correspondence. It very frequently is a guessing game. And this happens very, very rapidly. Once we've learned to read and become adept at it, it happens almost instantaneously. And we do not realize that our minds are actually going through this process and actually anticipating what's coming next, so that it can increase the likelihood that it lands on the intended meaning. And this is why optical illusions work, where you'll read a text and then you won't even realize that the word "the" occurs twice in a row or something like that. And I've got a bit of a sore throat. I hope you'll excuse me if I have to clear my throat tonight. And so when we have very similar experiences to the experiences and the knowledge of the individual who produced the linguistic expression, either spoke it or wrote it, we're more likely to land on the same meaning. But the further removed that person's experiences are in their knowledge of the agreements from our own, the more likely there is to be misunderstanding. And so now if we go 2,000 years or 3,000 years back into another culture, into another language, into another part of the world, the distance between us is enormous. And translations try to help close that gap to the degree possible. but even that is just a rough approximation. And so when we read the Bible, we are constructing the meaning in our minds as we read. And some of the things that influence or govern how we construct that meaning are things like the tradition that we're a part of, the way we've read it in the past, the people around us who are helping us to understand it, what we believe about the Bible, about its origin, about what it says. All of those things are going to influence how our minds construct that meaning on the text. And so I say this because I'm going to be sharing some interpretations of biblical texts that are probably not going to sound very familiar. And that's because if you read the text without thinking critically about the context within which it was written, without thinking about what frameworks were governing the authors who composed it, what they were concerned about, what their rhetorical goals were, we're going to reconstruct a meaning that's going to land closer to where we are. It's going to make the text more meaningful to us or more useful to us. And what I'm going to try to do is try to show you how alien the text really is when you try to reconstruct the interpretive lenses and the historical context and the rhetorical goals of the first millennium BCE or the first century CE. And yeah, this is, I refer to this frequently in my content as negotiating with the text. We cannot have any pure and unmediated access to the original meaning. We always have to negotiate with it. And that negotiation is between us, the text, any sacred past or heritage that we may be inheriting. And I want to start by talking about ancient sexual ethics and sexual politics. More generally, and then we'll move on to same-sex intercourse. And in the ancient world, sexual politics were very complicated and very different from how we understand them today. We also see different conceptual and moral frameworks governing the representation of sex in ancient Israel and Second Temple Judaism, in early Christianity. And when we look across the text, each author is being influenced by their own social circumstances, their own preferences, their own rhetorical goals. And so there's not a single sexual ethic within the Bible. There's not a single sexual ethic within the New Testament. There's not a single sexual ethic within the Hebrew Bible. There are frequently multiple different sexual ethics within a given book of the Bible because most of them have been edited and redacted. And so there are multiple different literary hands at play. Now, when we think about sex in the Hebrew Bible, we may think of legislation against adultery or metaphors about husbands and wives in the prophetic literature, but those are frequently misrepresented and are not consistent. An example of a text that kind of cuts against the grain when it comes to how we think about sex in the ancient world is the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, which was likely written in the Persian period. And it is a piece of erotic poetry that represents two young lovers, and there is absolutely no indication that they were married. In fact, the representation of the young woman's brothers oppressing and criticizing the young woman indicates she's still part of her father's household, and so is definitely not married. And this text was likely read in the early years of its circulation as an allegory for the Judahite people's longing for the land from which they had been separated. And the stories of Ruth and the story of Tamar illustrate an important aspect of the ethics of this period. In both instances, these are widows who are left without children or inheritance, and so are facing the prospect of a life of destitution, of living on the edges of society. And in each case, they use sex as a lure to secure both children and inheritance, and they are praised for it. In neither instance is the man's engaging in extramarital sex represented as in any way whatsoever inappropriate. But in each case, the result is that the man takes on obligations for the woman. The sex itself is not considered tainted or stigmatized, but each agent's social responsibilities or access to resources is influenced by the transactional nature of sex within that society. So an Israelite woman was expected to be a virgin when she became married and entered under the protective umbrella of the household of her husband. And without that protective umbrella, she would remain on the outskirts of society. Somebody asked if the slides are supposed to be changing, and kind of. Ooh, okay, I got them ahead of myself. No, the slides are not supposed to be changing. I'm not to that quote yet. So as a result of the fact that biblical legislation compelled an Israelite man who takes an Israelite woman's virginity to marry her. So a woman's supposed to be a virgin when she gets married. If a man takes her virginity, then she is no longer eligible for marriage. She is to be vulgar, tainted goods. Now, foreign women, slaves, and sex workers were already functioning on the outskirts of society, and so there was no social harm to be done by a man having intercourse with them, even if he was already married. So, in short, in the ancient world, adultery was not so much about a man having sex outside of his own marriage. It was about a woman having sex outside of marriage, or, well, yeah, pretty much that. A man having sex with a woman who was married to somebody else was the problem. A man just having sex with another woman who was not married was not as big a deal. The crime of adultery, yeah, so we got to that. Oh, and the reason it was a big deal, the crime of adultery was such a big deal, is because it is a violation of the other man's property rights. In this time period, women were frequently viewed as there were multiple dimensions of their personhood, but they were not full persons, and there were circumstances where they were treated more as property than as full autonomous agents. David's violation of Bathsheba was problematic because he took the property of another man, which is what Nathan's parable of the poor man and his lamb does with that story. Even this wasn't treated as seriously as adultery is supposed to be, however, and that's likely because Uriah was not a native Israelite, but a Hittite, so he was not under the full protection of the law. Women were frequently viewed more as property than as full persons with their own independent agency, and this is why Boaz, even though he accepts the proposal to enter into a kind of expanded notion of levirate marriage, first has to go find this next of kin and perform a transaction with that man who has the first right of refusal. Boaz can't acquire Ruth as property unless she is exchanged by the person who has the rights to her. And now we get to the quote. Jennifer Wright Knust's phenomenal book, Unprotected Texts, where she says, together the women place themselves within an established male-led household, manipulating existing property laws in their favor, but without challenging the basic validity of those same laws. The book never questions the view that women are property subject to exchange between men. The legal transaction between Boaz and Naomi's other male relative includes Ruth and a plot of land as a combined purchase, treating them as equivalent goods. And this social hierarchy is reflected as well in some of the biblical laws regarding slavery. Scholars consider Exodus's covenant code to be one of the oldest literary layers within the book of Exodus, and it runs from Exodus 21 to 22. And much of the legislation in there is drawn from the famous laws of Hammurabi, which date to about 1,000 years earlier. And a great book on that is David Wright's Inventing God's Law. In the part of the Covenant Code on debt slavery, the Covenant Code allows a man to sell himself into debt slavery and then be released after 7 years. If he's given a wife by his master, the wife and kids stay the property of the master. And this is closely related to the laws of Hammurabi's debt slavery legislation. But Hammurabi was more merciful than the God of Israel. He called for the release of debt slaves after only 3 years. Now, the Covenant Code is addressed to freeborn Israelite men and not to women. It does not allow women to sell themselves into debt slavery, but it does allow men to sell their daughters into debt slavery. This is because women were property. The only difference here is that women sold into debt slavery were not freed after 7 years. They were permanent slaves, at least according to the covenant code. And I think I have, yeah. Oh, this is the law of Hammurabi pointing out that debt slavery is only to last for 3 years, and in the 4th year they will go free. And then we have the rule about women staying permanent slaves. Within Israelite society, a woman's body was not her own property, but was the property of men, whether her father and brothers or her husband. Now, Exodus 21 does not call for her master to treat her in specific ways. Does call for her to be treated in specific ways so that her well-being is to some degree protected. So she has a degree of personhood and agency, but that overlaps with her social function as property. Now, Deuteronomy's law on debt slavery is different. Whereas Exodus explicitly says an Israelite woman sold by her father into slavery does not go free like Israelite men, Deuteronomy explicitly states that all Israelites sold as debt slaves, male or female, must go free after 7 years. Additionally, according to Deuteronomy 15, you also have to give them money. You have to recompense them for their time so that they don't go out empty-handed. And it also adds a reminder, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt and Adonai, your God, redeemed you. And so a critical point I want to make here, I'm trying to show a little bit about different social hierarchies and different social roles that individuals played, but I'm also making the point that these texts are not consistent and are not univocal. They directly conflict with each other here. And when we seek to interpret them in a way that harmonizes them and erases their differences, their distinctions, we are creating a new meaning that was never intended by any of the authors involved. And that's how we negotiate new significance with the text. And one of the driving forces behind this negotiation in contemporary reading of the Bible is the presupposition of univocality, the notion that the text speaks with one consistent and unified voice, which it absolutely does not. So a social hierarchy of power and domination sits at the root of the sexual ethic presented in the Hebrew Bible. And this hierarchy was closely related to similar hierarchies in other ancient Southwest Asian nations. An important part of this sexual ethic is the identification of two main sexual roles, that of the penetrator, which I will call the active role, and that of the penetrated, what I will refer to as the passive roles. These two roles were the foundation of ancient conceptualizations of sex. There was no understanding of sexuality or sexual orientation as we understand them today. The notion of active and passive also extended to how the agency of these actors was conceptualized. And there's a great book from about 30 years ago by David Halperin, where he explains, before the scientific instruction of sexuality, sex was a manifestation of personal status, a declaration of social identity. Sexual partners came in two significantly different kinds, not male and female, but active and passive, dominant and submissive. So on a social level, sex was not thought of as a mutual or a reciprocal act of jointly, consensually entered into by two autonomous agents. It was an action performed by one person upon another. Now, it's tempting to map this onto contemporary concepts of gender and just say that a male person plays the active role, a female person plays the passive role. So it's the same as today, but it's not so simple. The governing framework or principle was that the person doing the filling the active role was occupying a dominant role, which meant that it was inappropriate for a person whose body was socially constructed for that role to take a submissive position. The concept of penetrator versus penetrated was only one facet of the more fundamental concept of dominant and submissive roles. As a result, for a man to be on the bottom during sex, even with his own wife, was considered to violate that social hierarchy, though to a lesser degree. This was widespread around the ancient world and lasted for centuries. In first millennium BCE, There are lists of omens associated with sex. And one says that if a woman mounts a man, she saps him of his physical power as well as his personal god, which is a euphemism for his drive to succeed socially, for a month. Other Mesopotamian texts suggest that for a woman to be on top leads to ritual impurity. And there's a passage from centuries later in the Babylonian Talmud from B. Gittin 70a that suggests a man who lets his wife be on top during sex will be stricken with delaria, which scholars believe is a reference to diarrhea. And if you go look at that text, you will see they prescribe certain herbs following to help cure the man who has inflicted this upon himself. And even many centuries after that, the medieval Jewish text, the Alphabet of Ben Sira, attributes Lilith's departure from the Garden of Eden to Adam's refusal to take the submissive position and allow her to be on top. Now, many translations or discussions of this text will say that she refused to submit to his authority, but the text is a little more explicit about that. So this social hierarchy was foundational to ancient sexual ethics. You had a dominant person who was acting sexually upon a submissive person. So for a man to be penetrated sexually by another man was considered a violation of that social hierarchy, and so was only thought proper within those societies with enough social complexity and stratification for there to be lower classes that could take on that degree of shaming and debasement without compromising the whole social order. And I want to talk briefly about social order. This was entangled with cosmic order. And if that order was destabilized, it threatened the cosmic order as well, and vice versa. And that's not unique to sex. Social order was tied to cosmic order in a few different ways. For instance, in the Bible, in Egypt and Mesopotamia, things like the welfare of orphans and widows were seen as the proverbial canaries in the coal mine of cosmic stability and justice, which is why you see so many legislators boasting about how much they care for, or how much people need to care for, the orphan and the widow, or at least publicly boasting about it, because that ensured that the cosmic cycles associated with weather and planting and harvesting and everything was all carried out successfully, because those were the outward facing symbols. Now, these were always ideals, and these ideals governed the structuring of discourse and power about sex, but in actual practice, there would have been a spectrum of different agents involved who were deploying, confronting, and subverting these ideals at the intersection of a lot of different identities, circumstances, and relationships. So in other words, we can fairly confidently reconstruct how they talked about these concepts and frameworks on the surface, but on the individual level, these things would have played out in a lot of different ways that we cannot so confidently reconstruct. So I'm not definitively declaring that everyone thought about things this way and that these concepts governed every sexual interaction. I'm just sharing what we know about how social influencers and authorities talked about them, because the Bible is precisely social influencers and authorities talking about ideals. So as we move now to the Hebrew Bible and to those passages that may or may not deal with homosexuality, let's keep in mind these conceptualizations of social order, social hierarchies of domination and penetration, and of foundational concepts of sex as an act that a person taking on an active role commits on, rather than with a person taking on a passive role. Now, some folks see homosexual intercourse underlying the story of the curse of Ham in Genesis 9. Based primarily on the notion that the curse seems far too severe for someone having simply seen their father naked. And we also have the notion that Ham seeing his father's nakedness should be interpreted in light of the use elsewhere of the phrase uncovering one's nakedness as a euphemism for sexual intercourse. Seeing nakedness is far more commonly a reference to seeing shame or to seeing vulnerability, and to neglect one's responsibility to protect the honor of one's drunk and nude and therefore very vulnerable father would have been considered a pretty serious infraction. Now, Ham's brothers do the right thing, and they back into the tent and they drop a cloak over him to cover up their father without seeing his nakedness. And this part of the story doesn't really make any sense if we read a sexual indiscretion into the narrative, whether that's the maternal incest reading, which is popular, the idea that Ham violated his mother, or the paternal incest reading, which is where Ham violates his drunk and vulnerable father. I don't personally think that this passage has anything to do with sex at all, much less with same-sex intercourse. So I'm going to move on. The next passage that is frequently highlighted is Genesis 19, which tells the story of Lot protecting two angels who enter Sodom. The men of the town, from the old to the young, surround the house and demand that Lot turn over the two strangers so that they can be sexually violated. And Lot says, no, take my two virgin daughters instead, which is a shocking resolution to this problem that they're facing. And this is a hyperbolic story about hospitality and about the mistreatment of outsiders. And the take my daughters instead not only reflects the very subordinate, almost property-like role that his daughters would have filled in that society, but it is also a hyperbolic way of saying, see how far I'm willing to go to protect the stranger who is under my roof. Ultimately, the angels defend Lot's household from the men. And there's a parallel here in Judges 19. There's a story there about a Levite and his concubine who stop over in Gibeah to spend the night. And they are offered a place to stay by an old man. And during the night, the men of the town, who are called worthless in the text, surround the house and demand the Levite be brought out so that they might sexually violate him. This is a means of asserting domination within an honor and shame society. The owner of the house offers instead his own virgin daughter or the man's concubine. Similar to Genesis 19, the men aren't really interested, but there are no angels around to protect the household this time, so the concubine gets shoved out the door and is repeatedly assaulted by the men and ultimately dies from her injuries on the very doorstep of the house. When the man discovers her in the morning, he shockingly cuts her up into 12 pieces and sends a piece to each of the tribes of Israel as a symbol of the debauchery and the violence that had taken over Israel. So this is a period of the Judges. There was no king in Israel. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. I personally think Judges 19 is probably earlier than Genesis 19. And Genesis is likely a later adaptation and innovation on the story. But it's also possible they're both drawing from kind of a more generic shared tradition. Both stories incorporate the theme of same-sex sexual assault, but that's not really the main point or the primary concern of either story. It's more about, it's more a rhetorical element within a story that's more directly focused on hospitality within an honor and shame context and how outsiders are treated. Because the Levite wanted to avoid all of the non-Israelite towns because he felt like he would be treated better in an Israelite town, even though he was not from that tribe. There are other places in the Bible where the story of Genesis 19 is referenced, and they also support the understanding that other themes are more salient than same-sex assault, much less just same-sex intercourse in and of itself. For instance, we have Ezekiel 16:49. This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and the needy. They were haughty, and they did abominable things before me. Therefore, I removed them when I saw it. So here we have that reference to the poor and the needy. These are symbols just like the orphan and the widow. They were not honoring the social stability, the social order. The main point that Ezekiel is making is that they violated principles of social justice. Social stability must be maintained, and when the margins of society are not provided for, the order breaks down and God will intervene. Now, some people see a more explicit reference to same-sex intercourse in relation to Genesis 19 in the New Testament, specifically in the book of Jude, which says in verse 7, likewise Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which in the same manner as they indulged in sexual immorality and pursued what we have here, different flesh, sarkos heteros, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. So most scholars would say this isn't a reference to same-sex intercourse. The context of this part of the book of Jude is the nature of angels and their relationship to humans. Verse 6 refers to angels who didn't keep their first estate, but abandoned their place of residence and are being kept in eternal chains. And this is a reference to first Enoch, which expands and elaborates on the story of the sons of God in Genesis 6, who come down and marry and have children with the daughters of humanity. Thus, verse 7 begins by referring to the same thing happening in verse 7. In other words, the problem, according to the author of Jude, is humans attempting sexual intercourse with angels. It's not targeting same-sex intercourse. And the possibility of sexual compatibility between angels and humans is a big deal in the Greco-Roman period and into the 1st century CE, because this is ostensibly the origin of fallen angels, of demons, and all these kinds of things. But is that something that they were allowed to do? Is it something that was physically possible? There are rabbinic texts that reinterpret what's going on in Genesis 6 to suggest that angels were merely present when women were having intercourse with their own husbands. There are a bunch of different ways the text is renegotiated within this debate about whether or not it was possible for angels to have intercourse with humans. So this is a participant in that debate. But this still would have been considered a violation and an overturning of the social hierarchies of domination and penetration. Now this brings us to Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. These are two of the central chapters of what is known as the Holiness Code, which runs from Leviticus 17 through 26. These chapters are believed by most scholars to have been originally independent pieces of legislation that were secondarily added to the writings of the priestly authors somewhere in the exilic or post-exilic period, so between 600 and 300-ish BCE. The priestly authors were members of the priestly class within Israel. They wrote and edited their own version of the traditions now contained in the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch. The Deuteronomist was another group, another author, a group of authors who had their own version. You know what, I'm gonna skip through some of this. The Holiness Code expands the requirements for holiness from just the priestly class to all of Israel, and in many places extends the requirements even to foreigners who may be residing in the land. So the Holiness Code within the priestly writings is really one-upping the priestly writings themselves. Priestly writings are primarily about priests. Holiness Code says, you know what? We're going to bring everybody in. And the point, at least according to chapter 18, is to distinguish the residents of Israel from the Canaanite and Egyptian residents who had inhabited the land beforehand. That way they maintain a degree of holiness and purity that will allow them to stay in the land and not be purged from the land by the land itself. I wonder if I have the... No, don't have it here. In other words, this legislation keeps Israel from contaminating the land, which would result in the lands vomiting them out. So there's this metaphysical conceptualization going on of impure practices generating kind of a metaphysical contaminant that cannot be tolerated by the land. Most scholars agree that Leviticus 18 is the earlier of the 2 chapters here, and that chapter 20 is a later restating and expansion of what is found in chapter 18. And I want to address 3 things underlying the rhetoric of these 2 chapters. One is the intuitive notion that certain actions to which the majority of folks would have had an intuitive aversion would have produced a kind of metaphysical contamination that would have been released into the natural world. In other words, same-sex intercourse here is perceived as polluting, contaminating, because the majority of people in the society would have had an intuitive aversion to it. And my euphemism for this whole framework of that intuitive cognition, when sometimes it does not like things, not because there's anything wrong with those things, but because they're not used to it, and because they've been conditioned, they've been habituated not to like it. And so when I refer to that intuitive aversion, I refer to something being icky. So if I say something's icky, what I mean is that people just have an intuitive aversion to it. They don't know why. They're not really happy about it. They don't like it. And then they come up with rationalizations for why it's bad. And there's an interesting discussion about this in Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, where he develops a framework for how this all works that is a little not widely accepted in the world of the cognitive sciences, but the underlying logic that we frequently develop moral principles and ethical principles based on intuitive reactions and reflexes. That's pretty sound stuff. So this intuitive aversion to same-sex intercourse would be an example of that. That is ultimately the root of a lot of the condemnation, a lot of the refusal to accept, is that it is, for most people who are not used to it, who are conditioned not to like it, it is icky. And now I've completely lost my place. Okay. So we have this notion of purity and cleanliness that developed hand in hand with concepts of holiness, and a lot of that builds on what they thought was icky. 2, these chapters presuppose a strict notion of the social hierarchy of domination and of penetration on the part of the active agent that I described earlier. Note that almost all of the commandments are addressed only to men. Men were the main subject of virtually all the legislation in the Holiness Code. The sexual prohibitions here are about what women are, are about which women men are not allowed to have sex with. Chapter 18 uses second-person masculine singular commands, and chapter 20 refers in the third person to any man who does X, Y, and Z. They are the agents who act upon the passive non-agent or half-agent, who is mostly women, but in one instance, other men. There's only one piece of legislation across these 2 chapters that directly addresses a sexual partner that a woman specifically may not act upon in a sexual way. And that partner is an animal. That's the only sexual act where a woman is in the socially higher position and therefore is the dominant agent. And I think I have so we got the 2 examples in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. Okay, I thought I had put the passage in here. It's the passages right after these 2 in Leviticus 18 and 20, where it says you won't lie with an animal, and then it says also a woman shall not lie with an animal. In the rest of the legislation, the woman is the person being acted upon. And so these passages are very much operating within that broader social hierarchy of domination and penetration. Now, here in Leviticus 18 and 20, 18:22 says literally, with a male you will not lie the lyings of a woman. The phrase lyings of a woman, mishkaveh isha, is not incredibly clear, and the only 2 occurrences in all the Bible are here and in Leviticus 20. It's obviously derived from the phrase mishkav zachar, lying of a man, which is used to refer to how a woman lies down with a man. People have explained a few different interpretations of this phrase, both anciently and in modern scholarship, but I am partial to Saul Oleon's reading from the 90s, which is cited in the bibliography that I'm going to be providing with the recording of this class. And according to Saul, lying the lyings of a woman with a male means to have sex with a male the way you would have sex with a woman. In other words, this passage specifically prohibits taking the active or penetrative role in an act of male same-sex intercourse. This is not the only reading, but I think this is the most common and the most likely one among scholars. Within the broader context of this chapter and of the Holiness Code as a whole, this prohibition prohibits a sexual act that would pollute the land and risk the people's ejection from it, so it should such pollution not be adequately dealt with. So why precisely is this considered a polluting act? To begin, within the context of that social hierarchy, it debases the male who is put into the passive role The active participant is considered the acting agent, with the passive participant being acted upon. There's only one other piece of legislation in all of ancient Southwest Asia that at all approximates this law, and that's Middle Assyrian Law A20, which says if a man has had sex with his neighbor and he has been charged and convicted, then he is to be considered defiled and made into a eunuch, which declares that sexual subordination, emasculation, or feminization of one's freeborn male neighbor is punished by castration. Ultimately, even that social hierarchy logic is a rationalization of what most likely originates in that intuitive aversion that the majority of folks within those societies would have been conditioned to feel towards same-sex intercourse. Additionally, we have considerations associated with the emission of semen, which is considered to render one ritually unclean in a number of perfectly acceptable sexual contexts, but is also considered valuable as a potential human life. So any emission could potentially render one ritually impure, and to waste, so to speak, that semen was even more problematic. To do so within an act of male same-sex intercourse, which debased someone who was supposed to take the dominant role, was even more problematic. This logic may undergird the concern that was expressed, but we can't know for sure. The fundamental objection was no doubt an intuitive one. Now, Leviticus 20:13 expands on 18:22. Many scholars would say it's a later renegotiation of Leviticus 18, which doesn't prohibit or even address the agency of the passive partner in the act of male same-sex intercourse. The same is true of all the women addressed in the other prohibitions in Leviticus 18. The concern is for the acting agent, almost always, except for one instance, a man. Leviticus 20:13 condemns both participants to death, as it does the women who are acted upon by men in many of the other sexual relationships declared to be illicit in Leviticus 18. Elsewhere, women are not held responsible for men imposing their agency upon them. This seems an oddly severe response that doesn't really line up with the rest of the Hebrew Bible. There's a case to make that Leviticus 20 has been edited in those places where death is incurred by both the acting party and the party acted upon. In many of those cases, there are odd shifts in number within a clause or a sentence that are rather ungrammatical, and that could be interpreted as an indication that the text has been manipulated. Now, whether or not that's the case, Leviticus 20 views the contamination or pollution of these sexual acts as covering both the party who acted and the party who acted upon, and so both must die in order to expunge the pollution from the land. At least that's what the text says. Whether or not these oppressive penalties were ever carried out is an open question. The foundation of these two passages, I would argue, is an intuitive notion of this activity as icky for people in positions of authority, and the governing social frameworks in rationalizing that were those hierarchies of domination and penetration. Conceptual frameworks related to the importance of procreation and to notions of purity and contamination were also brought to bear on the question. Now, I'm going to skip over David and Jonathan for a moment. It talks a bit about his love for Jonathan surpassing the love of women, and that could be interpreted to mean that there was a sexual dimension, a romantic dimension to it, or it could be interpreted to mean it was just a very powerful platonic one. I think either reading is plausible. 1 Samuel 20, verse 30 has Saul berate his son and rhetorically ask, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? I think there's a stronger case to make here that this may reference a romantic dimension, but I don't know that we have enough data to be able to say for sure one way or another. And I've shared that in some of my social media content before, that I just don't know. I can see it going either way. It's a bit of a toss-up for me. Now, before I move on to Greco-Roman period Judaism, I want to point out that female same-sex intercourse is absolutely nowhere addressed at all in the Hebrew Bible. Now, there's some folks who suggest that may be going on between Ruth and Naomi. And again, that's certainly possible, maybe even plausible, but I don't think it's probable. Now, some of the latest texts we have in the Hebrew Bible were written during the Greco-Roman period, from the end of the 4th century BCE up to the early centuries of the Common Era. And this was a period of significant literary and ideological development within Judaism. And there were numerous texts written in this period that would influence later Judaism and Christianity. And we see in this literature Judaism renegotiating its sexual ethic and its understanding of same-sex intercourse. And I want to talk briefly about some of the forces that are underlying this. One of the things that's going on here is Judaism was a smaller nation, was being pushed around by larger empires. And so in order to protect their ethnic integrity, the boundaries of their ethnic group, they have to establish more significant, more severe identity markers. That helps in what's called costly signaling. And that is a standard or something that is expected from members of the group in order to signal to the other members of the group that you can be trusted, you belong, you are one of them. And we do this in all kinds of different ways today. Just the act of shaking someone's hand is a way to show, hey, I am familiar with the basic etiquette of human interaction and I'm willing to engage in it. And that's a signal to others that you can be trusted, you belong. And so the more costly in a social or even a physical or financial way, a signal, the more valuable as a signal it is, the more powerful as a signal it is. All right, excuse me just a moment. I'm going to take a drink. Now, in the broader Greco-Roman world, there was a degree to which male same-sex intercourse was considered somewhat acceptable. And so we also have a bit of distinction going on here. We're different from them. And this is what some scholars have referred to as schismogenesis, which is where you create and curate boundaries by latching onto and centering areas of distinction. So this is what makes us different. Those guys over there do that, we do this, and that then becomes a central identity marker. The flat prohibition on male same-sex intercourse here in Leviticus seems very much to have functioned precisely as one of these identity markers for this smaller and less stratified nation that was being shoved around by the much larger empires of Babylon and Persia. And it only became more significant in the Greco-Roman period because of the relative tolerance of male same-sex intercourse within those much larger and more socially stratified empires of Greece and Rome. Early Jewish opposition to same-sex intercourse is thus going to be more deeply entrenched, precisely because that opposition functions to help in boundary maintenance and in costly signaling and credibility-enhancing displays. Another factor in the literature of the Greco-Roman period is the increased exposure to philosophical thought, which influenced a lot of the literary exploration of that time period. A lot of Jewish law seemed arbitrary in the eyes of Greco-Roman thinkers, and so intellectuals within Judaism began to adopt philosophical frameworks not only to explain, defend, and rationalize their law, but also to negotiate with it. Like I mentioned, female same-sex intercourse was not prohibited in the law, but most within the Greco-Roman world considered it rather deviant. It was women trying to be counterfeit penetrators. And so they referred to lesbians with the word thrivas, which comes from the verb to rub. That was a pejorative that they used. And Judaism adopted some of their rationalizations for this deviance. Male same-sex intercourse had a more socially acceptable outlet within the Greco-Roman world based on this notion of a hierarchy of domination and penetrability. As the prototypical penetrators, men were thought of as walking hammers, walking around looking for anything that might appear to be a nail. Now, while female bodies were the most prototypically penetrable, young men and boys, because they were considered to have soft skin and were relatively hairless, they also had a degree of penetrability within that social framework. As a result, it was considered perfectly natural and understandable for men to be sexually attracted to boys and young men. It was frequently considered totally understandable, but young men and boys of the same social class were considered off limits, and such relationships could damage the reputation of their parents and their own future participation in society. Slaves, however, were considered the most acceptable outlet for those walking hammers. This was a pretty widespread rationalization of the desire for men to penetrate others, but desiring the passive role was thought of as a pathology, as something less acceptable and understandable. People accounted for it in different ways, but once a male reached adulthood, that wasn't widely thought to be appropriate. And so it was more common for grown men who sought out the passive role to be stigmatized or marginalized, though that differed from time to time and place to place. And to my knowledge, the notion of a versatile role wasn't a commonplace. On the social level of the discourse, folks were pigeonholed as seeking out either the active role or the passive role, and there were different values and assumptions associated with each one. Other aspects of sexuality were adopted from Stoic, Platonic, and even Pythagorean ethical systems, and the more conservative, the better. As a smaller and vulnerable ethnic group, a more conservative social position made it easier to preserve the integrity of the boundaries. And all of the Jewish literature from this period that happens to address in some way same-sex intercourse speaks of it in a condemnatory way. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into much of it. In fact, I'm going to have to skip over a little bit, but I want to touch real quickly on the fact that one of the central features of the sexual frameworks that were widespread within the Greco-Roman period was the notion that sexual passion and desire existed in order to incentivize reproduction, but those things were to be tempered or suppressed entirely outside of sexual acts that were within marriage and that had the specific goal of procreation. And so for many Greco-Roman thinkers, including Jewish ones like Philo, like Josephus, having sex with one's own wife only for pleasure was considered inappropriate. That was not allowed. It wasn't as bad as adultery or same-sex intercourse, but sex was only for procreation. It was not for enjoyment, and it was enjoyable only so that it incentivized procreation. And if you engaged in it outside of that, you removed the boundaries, the guardrails on sexual desire and passion, and it could become excessive. This was kind of the, you'll go blind or your palms will get hairy rhetoric of antiquity. They would say your vitality would be sapped. Philo and Josephus talk about the feminizing disease. They even suggested that people who habitually engaged in male same-sex intercourse would become sterile, and so this would be a threat to the survival of the society. These were all ways to rationalize what fundamentally was something that they just didn't like the sounds of. Okay, and this brings us to Paul, who scholars overwhelmingly agree was a celibate man. And that rather dogmatic position very clearly affected his personal sexual ethic, which is wildly distinct from virtually all Christians' sexual ethics today. So like Philo, he draws from Stoic, Platonic, and Pythagorean philosophical frameworks, recognizes the threat that could be posed by sexual desire if it was left unchecked and allowed to run free. Unlike Philo, though, as well as most other Jewish folks from his day, Paul nowhere champions procreation as a legitimate reason for sexual intercourse. He talks about those who already have children, but he doesn't ever praise the desire to have children. And the reason for this seems to be his belief, repeated in a bunch of places, that the time is short. In other words, Jesus is coming back too quickly for any of this to matter. And we see that in 1 Corinthians 7, where he says his rule in all the churches is that everybody remain in the conditions, the state you were in when you were called by God. If you don't have kids, don't try to have kids. There's no time for that. So sex was not for procreation. The ideal was celibacy, but there was an exception. If you could not hack celibacy, it was okay to get married so that you could have just enough sex to stifle your sexual desire. And we have but it's better to marry than to burn, is what the text says, or be aflame with passion. And in 1 Thessalonians 1 Thessalonians 4, 4 and 5, he says that each man should possess his own vessel, and vessel there is a reference to his wife, in holiness and honor, not with the passion of desire, like the Gentiles who do not know God. So Paul is imposing the expectation that Christians keep total control of sexual desire and only get married if they are unable to completely stifle that desire. Sex is not an expression of love. It's not a legitimate, pleasurable activity. It's not even for procreation. If you have it at all, it's just to keep you from wanting to have it. So Paul's sexual ethic is entirely irrelevant to most peoples today, but this is the context within which we hear about same-sex intercourse. The first Pauline text I want to look at is Romans. We're not going to read all of this. I want to start with Paul setting the stage. Basically, nature testifies of God, so the Gentiles have no excuse for not worshiping the God of Israel. Instead, they worship the works of human hands, so they are at fault. They are without excuse. And as a result of this willful rejection of God, Paul says God allowed their passions and desires to run wild, gave them up to the lusts of their hearts. So this seems to suggest that there was some kind of restriction that God was placing on sexual desire for those who are righteous. In other words, same-sex intercourse, these unrighteous, excessive desires that the Gentiles experience, we don't experience because we worship God appropriately. Therefore, God is protecting us. God is allowing us to keep our sexual desires in check. Now, we get down to the bottom and we have verse 26. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. Now, this is the NRSV, but there are things that could be more clearly translated. It doesn't say intercourse. It says chresis, which means usefulness or utility. So their women exchange their natural utility for unnatural utility. What is the utility of a woman here? It's not for procreation. It's not for any kind of expression of love. What Paul seems to be saying is that women are useful as a vessel in order for men to have just enough sex to stifle their sexual desire. And what is unnatural about it? Most people would say, oh, well, this goes against the created order. The idea is that Paul is looking back to Genesis and the notion that men and women are designed to go together, but that doesn't really fit Paul's rhetoric elsewhere regarding nature and what it dictates. The idea here seems to be that it violates the natural order of the hierarchy of domination and subordination of penetration. So these women, as with what most other Greco-Roman thinkers said, are trying to be counterfeit penetrators. In the same way, also men giving up natural intercourse with women were consumed with passion one for another. So again, because God has removed the bumper lanes from the Gentiles' sexuality, it is running wild and free, and so they are even engaging in sexual intercourse with each other. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. So men are similarly described as being consumed with that dirty sexual desire that we are to avoid, to the degree that they engaged in sexual intercourse with each other. And this due penalty, scholars think, may either be a reference to soreness or to some of those diseases that were imagined to afflict men who engaged habitually in same-sex intercourse. Now, I'm over time already. I apologize for that. I should have planned this better. The only other text from the genuinely Pauline letters that refers to same-sex intercourse is found in the Vice list of 1 Corinthians 6:9, which uses two words here that I have left in transliteration in the middle, malaki or malakoi, and arsenokite or arsenokoitai. Malaki means something like soft things, but when it's used in reference to adult men, it was a pretty conventional pejorative term that was used to refer to men who were effeminate and who sought out the passive role in male same-sex intercourse. This was a separate and distinct role from the arsenokete, which is a compound word that Paul seems to have coined based on the Greek translation of Leviticus 18:22. It likely means something like men betters, and most likely referred to men who function in the active role of male same-sex intercourse. By putting them side by side, Paul was highlighting both the active and the passive role, both as examples of unrighteous behavior. And people stayed in one or the other role anciently. Again, on the level of social discourse, people were understood to fill one role or fill the other role. And they had different explanations and values attached to each of those. Paul obviously takes a condemnatory stance, but his position is still definitely informed by that broader social world and by Greco-Roman philosophical thought, as well as his own historical situatedness. We see family life and procreation championed by the letters attributed to Paul, but written years after his death, because by then the reality of the second coming was being delayed, had set in, things were being renegotiated. No, there had to be a falling away first before Christ comes back. While we're here, we might as well plan for the future. So yeah, you should probably have family and children, which is the complete opposite of Paul's concern for the present crisis, for the time being short. Everybody stay in the conditions in which you were called. So what does this mean for today? A lot of people read the biblical text as informing our world now, as an authoritative within our world today. But even in the days in which these texts were themselves written, they were actively renegotiating social standards within specific historical circumstances and in light of their own view of their own sacred past. And every generation since then has added new layers to the cumulative sacred past that has now come down to the folks who read the Bible authoritatively today. One thing that never changes, however, is the fact that negotiating with the biblical text is most commonly done on an individual and on a social level in order to make the text meaningful and useful for us today within our own circumstances. And whichever of those takes priority, meaning being meaningful or being useful, contemporary circumstances and conceptual frameworks are going to be heavily influential. The overwhelming majority of negotiations with the Bible that take place on the social level are aimed at structuring power and values so as to serve the interests of one's own social identities. Many of the conceptual frameworks and the social circumstances that were influential in the days of the authors of Leviticus or in Philo or Paul's day are no longer influential, are long rejected, or don't even exist anymore. We already renegotiate away so much from their day. Slavery, treating women as property, even the rest of Paul's sexual ethic, we have renegotiated away. I don't know how many conversations I've had on Twitter with contemporary Christians who refuse to accept the overwhelming academic consensus regarding Paul's insistence on celibacy and the fact that he just did not care about procreation. That just does not compute for a lot of folks who read Paul today, because they're reading it through the interpretive lenses of different circumstances. It doesn't matter to us anymore, all these things we've renegotiated away, because those things don't make the text more meaningful to us or useful on an individual or on a social level. Condemning homosexuality, however, continues to be a significant identity marker to many groups. And not because they know all these details about the history of same-sex intercourse in the Bible, or because the Bible actually identifies anything fundamental to same-sex intercourse that would render it problematic within a 21st century world, but because the social circumstances still exist today that make it a meaningful identity marker and make it useful, costly signaling and useful as a credibility-enhancing display. As an example, just this week, a pro hockey player refused to suit up for a game where he was expected to wear a jersey supportive of the LGBTQ plus community, and he refused. And this was a way to put on display to the public that he was willing to incur social costs in order to defend that social standard. And you see that display being championed in a lot of different ways. Others are holding him up as an example of good Christian integrity and celebrating the fact that his jersey has sold out in the team store. In this way, he has been seen of men and he has his reward, to quote Jesus in the New Testament. Unfortunately, to be seen of men, and to gain that reward, he must engage in rhetoric that has resulted in countless lives lost, countless lives ruined, untold suffering, untold abuse, untold different things, all in the name of an identity marker, something that can be leveraged to improve one's social standings. And even my printer's upset about that. I don't know if you heard that. So this is fundamentally, this functions as an identity marker. It functions as a means of costly signaling. It functions as a credibility enhancing display. And it does not, and the fact that it is so damaging and so harmful and has caused so much suffering and death only escalates the cost and therefore the power of that stance as costly signaling, as a credibility enhancing display. And I think that is unfortunate. And I think that is a problem. That is something that we need to address. Thank you very much for your attention. I apologize for my voice tonight.